Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Welcome to our class Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we're discussing chapter 8 of Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, called, what was it called? Sankhya and Yoga, right?
Yeah.
Sankhya and Yoga. It's the first of several chapters discussing Sankhya. It's based on 2.39, verse 39 of chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita. I know we're only at 2.32, but because we have a lot to cover, and I want to focus on some of the subtleties and details of this chapter that we studied for today, what I'm going to do is very briefly summarize 2.32 to 2.38, and then we're going to focus on 2.39 and Sri Aurobindo's chapter on Sankhya. Okay? So, what does Krishna say between 2.32 and 2.38? Well, he shifts to, like a good lawyer, as I always say, shifts to a lower standpoint and says, Arjuna, even as a Kshatriya, your social duty is to fight. And you see, people are going to make fun of you and ridicule you and criticize you if you don't fight in the war. And what's worse than infamy for a warrior, for a brave warrior? Okay, all this stuff is kind of a lower standpoint. And then, in 2.38, he shifts to a slightly higher standpoint. Sukha dukkhe sme kritva labha labha jaya jaya. This is a higher standpoint because Krishna is now telling him in 2.38, but actually the higher view is not to be affected by praise or blame, by success or failure. It's not the highest standpoint, but it's moving up to the highest standpoint. Okay, that's all prelude to 2.39. So now let's look at 2.39. So please repeat after me. Can you open the app or whatever book you have? Esha te vihita sankhye. Okay, most of you are not there yet. Is that okay? So just try to open it first. 2.39. Chapter 2, verse 39. I'll try again. Esha te vihita sankhye. Buddhir yoge tvimam shranu. Buddhya yukto yaya partha karma bandham prahasyasi. Hey Partha, Krishna tells Arjuna, Esha buddhihi te sankhye abhita. I've just explained the buddhi from the standpoint of Sankhya. I've just explained, which means in the preceding verses. He doesn't mean the immediately preceding verses. That wouldn't make sense because he's talking about people will make fun of you. Not those. But what are the main verses? The ones talking about how you are the self, separate from the body-mind complex, which is the keynote of those verses in chapter 2, which come up again and again. Najayate mriyate vakada. Okay, that's what he's thinking of as Sankhya. Imam tu yoge shrunu. Now, for the rest of the chapter, not rest of the chapter, but coming up in the chapter, Imam tu yogeshunu. Now listen to my teachings on yoga. What does he mean by yoga? Yaya buddhya yuktaha karma bandham prahasasi. This is a special kind of yoga. Spoiler alert, it's karma yoga. By which you can break the bondage of the bonds of karma. Yeah. By engaging in action selflessly. So that's going to be the focus of the next chapter. Our next assignment, the date of the next class is not yet determined. We won't have any more classes in April. I'll be in Boston from 21st to 28th. So the next assignment is, please listen carefully, 2.40 to 2.53. Just read the verses, okay? That's 14 verses. And read the next chapter of Essays on the Gita, chapter 9, called Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta, pages 81 to 93. It's about 12 pages. And you have at least, I know that this was a bit tricky because we had back-to-back classes. And so it's a lot to read and then assimilate and then also answer study questions for those of you who did them. Okay, so I'll let you know when the next class is when I figure it out. Now, this whole chapter that we studied for today is discussing what Krishna means by Sankhya. Okay, because the term Sankhya comes up again and again in the Gita. It doesn't mean exactly what's meant by classical Sankhya. There's an ancient school of classical Sankhya philosophy, which the Gita was fully aware of, as the Upanishads are aware of. It's the oldest school of Indian philosophy. And it's not completely different from it either. It's sort of related to the classical Sankhya, and yet it's also different in some ways. And it's very important for us to understand in what ways the Gita's, what Sri Aurobindo calls the Gita's Vedantic Sanka philosophy, is similar to what it shares with classical Sankhya, and how it differs from classical Sankhya. You might think this sounds like a very dry, technical kind of comparison, philosophical discussion. Why is it relevant? But it's profoundly relevant. Because what Sri Aurobindo calls the Vedantic Sankhya of the Gita is the overarching philosophical and spiritual framework of the Bhagavad Gita. And he's going to use it for the remainder of his commentary, and it gives us a kind of bird's eye view of where everything fits together in literally one diagram. Okay. Figure 2, which I worked hard on. These are both, figures 1 and 2 are both taken from my book on Vivekananda. Figure 1 directly from my book, chapter 9. And figure 2 is a slightly modified version of a chart that you find in my Vivekananda book as well. We're going to get to these things one at a time. Okay. So now, first, classical Sankhya. And we can't spend too much time on this, but I want to explain it briefly. What is this ancient Sankhya school of philosophy? It's considered to be a dualistic philosophy. Dualistic in what sense? There are two basic entities, Purusha on the one hand and Prakriti on the other. Purusha is sentient, conscious. It's an eternal soul. It's immaterial, non-physical, and inactive. That's also important. It's not a doer or anything like that, karta. Prakriti, on the other hand, you can call it, so Purusha you can translate roughly as an eternal conscious soul. Prakriti, nature. But this nature, now please look at figure 1. So back of the first page of the 3-page handout. Alice, you have the handouts, right? Yeah, great. So figure 1, the dualist system, and please add here the dualist system of classical Sankhya, because I don't want you guys to get confused between which Sankhya, is it the Gita Sankhya, or we're talking about classical Sankhya now, okay? The dualist system of classical Sankhya. There's a conscious self, a Purusha, and then on the other side we have insentient Prakriti. And Prakriti is also unmanifest, avyakta. From that unmanifest Prakriti comes everything we see in this world, starting with intellect. The Sanskrit term is buddhi. It's just all, I'm just going through the diagram here. From that comes ahankara, ego sense. From that comes manas, mind, and the 5 sense capacities, 5 action capacities, 5 subtle elements, and the 5 gross elements. All of these comprise the 24 cosmic principles. If you count them, 20 plus mind, ego sense, intellect, and prakriti becomes 24 cosmic principles. Okay? Sri Ramakrishna often refers to Chaturvingshati Tattva. Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. So even Sri Ramakrishna accepts the Sankhyan cosmology of 24 cosmic principles. Not that he accepts it wholesale. Just as the Gita doesn't accept Sankhya wholesale, neither does Sri Ramakrishna. But in what ways does he accept Sankhya, and in what ways does he differ? These are things that we're going to be discussing today. So now look at the diagram here. You might ask, what is the connection between the Purusha and Prakriti? First of all, there are multiple Purushas. This is one thing to keep in mind. In both Sankhya and Yoga philosophy, each of us has a different corresponding Purusha. Okay. Why do we suffer? We suffer because we mistakenly identify ourselves with the body-mind complex. In reality, we are Purushas, completely separate from and unaffected by Prakriti. We're not the body-mind, we're eternal conscious souls. We suffer because we don't know it. So it's a kind of mistaken identity. Okay. So, through spiritual practice, what happens? I'm able to separate my nature from Prakriti and attain what's called kaivalya, which literally means aloneness or isolation. Whose aloneness? The Purushas. So I recognize that, I was this Purusha all along, and I never was bound up with Prakriti. I was never this body-mind. And I foolishly suffered because I thought I was. But now we get to Bala's first question. He has two interesting questions. The first question is, it's related to this issue of, Aurobindo says in the beginning of the chapter that Purusha gives consent or withholds consent from Prakriti. So Purusha is going to give a nod to Prakriti and say, now go ahead and do your thing. And then liberation is when Purusha withdraws his consent from Prakriti. And Prakriti stops and goes back to its unmanifest state, ceases to trouble Purusha. But then in the very same chapter, a few pages later, Sri Aurobindo himself says, but actually that was just a manner of speaking. Purusha neither gives nor withdraws consent. Why? Because by definition, Purusha can't do any of that. It's completely inactive, and that's another action in a sense. It's a mental action, but it's still... And Purusha doesn't have a mind. Mind is on the side of Prakriti. It's nature. And more deeply, Purusha can never be bound. Purusha is nitya mukta. It's ever liberated. It was never bound up with Prakriti. Purusha in reality has no connection whatsoever with Prakriti. So then the question is, you remember, go back 1 minute ago when I was talking about how we suffer because we mistakenly identify? Who's the we? This is at the heart of your question, I think.
Yeah, because
who's the we?
Multiple Purusha.
Yeah, but this is very tricky. Who is the we? One answer is Purusha. Can't be Purusha. Why? Because Purusha is nitya mukta and is never bound. It's eternally liberated. Can't be Purusha. What if the answer is Prakriti? Which is one of the standard answers. Specifically Buddhi, let's say. Buddhi is supposed to be insentient because it's on the side of Prakriti. An insentient entity can't think anything and can't feel suffering. To feel suffering, you have to be conscious. To mistakenly identify yourself with the body-mind complex, you also have to be conscious. Mistaken identification itself is a conscious activity. It's a conscious process. So now, if both those answers are excluded, what else is left? Well, not much, to be honest. That's the problem, is that that's what metaphysical dualism means. There's Purusha on the one hand, and then there's Prakriti on the other. If we could posit some kind of intermediate entity, that could sort of help to solve the problem. And so, in fact, even some Sankhya scholars do. Hariharananda Aranya was a great 20th century Sankhya yogi and a practitioner and a great monk. So he brings in this concept of the Jiva. And he says it's actually the Jiva which feels suffering and which is liberated ultimately. What is the Jiva? He says the Jiva is somehow, it's very tricky, he writes in Bangla and Sanskrit, the conjunction of, or somehow the union of, Purusha and Prakriti. The Buddhi illuminated by the Purusha. Something like that. Okay.
The reflected consciousness.
Reflected consciousness.
Goes to Vedanta.
Yeah. But again, there's still a problem. Well, the thing is, but Vedanta actually posits a Jiva. We'll get to that in a second.
Right.
But Sankhya does not have a category for Jiva.
So the Purusha itself is the...
Yeah, but then the problem, even if we work with that, let's explore that possibility. There's this Jiva, which is, we are Jivas suffering. The Jiva is the union of Purusha and Prakriti. First problem is, there's no such thing as a union of Purusha and Prakriti according to Sankhya itself. Purusha and Prakriti are never united, by definition. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a dualism anymore. Big problem. Then you can say, well, there's an illusion of a union. So then you're moving in the direction of saying essentially that the Jiva is a phantom entity. That thing or that entity, that being which thinks it's suffering, is ultimately unreal. It doesn't exist. And its liberation is the recognition in us, or is its dissolution. I was about to say it's recognition that it doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist anymore. So how can anything that doesn't exist recognize that it doesn't exist? It just vanishes. Okay, so these problems are very complicated. Different scholars in the past several millennia have debated these issues, and there's no easy answer within the Sankhyan framework. So you hit on something really deep there. Okay, the other issue which Bala brings up, which is also interesting, is sometimes Sankhya seems to be saying, and Sri Aurobindo sometimes hints at this, that when one attains liberation, Purusha, the Prakriti itself kind of resolves itself back into the unmanifest state. It ceases to play its games for Purusha, right? In yoga philosophy, that process is called pratiprasava. It kind of withdraws back into its unmanifest state. So then another problem. Let's say one person is liberated. That means nature sort of devolves back into the unmanifest state, right? And yet, we're still stuck here and we still see this nature in the manifest state. How is that possible? Another big philosophical problem, and there's a lot of debate about this. There's a book I can send you, there's a soft copy. Mikhail Burley, he's a Sankhya Yoga scholar. He wrote a whole book called Classical Sankhya and Yoga, where he thinks it's a genuine philosophical problem within Sankhya philosophy, and it doesn't have an easy answer. So what he says is, any realist interpretation of the Sankhya philosophy, realist, to believe that there's actually stuff out there, independently of us, runs into these philosophical problems. Okay. And so he ends up defending a kind of idealist interpretation of Sankhya. Idealism in the sense of, this world doesn't have independent existence apart from my perception of it. If you adopt a more idealistic understanding of Sankhya, then you can sort of avoid some of these problems.
But the reason I asked that question, Swami, is on one hand they actually are using this point that one person's realization doesn't mean others are realizing. That's why multiple purusas. But
and yet they're not
the same thing.
They're not out of the woods yet, exactly. Because one of the main reasons they posit a multiplicity of purusas is to account for the fact that when one person is liberated, other people can still remain behind, bound, and yet they run into this other problem.
From Prakriti side.
It's tricky
because it's only one.
Yeah. So arguably, one of the advantages of this Vedantic Sanka of the Gita is that it can solve this problem in a more satisfactory way. That's part of the reason why study questions 2 and 3 are formulated in this way. You see. How does classical Sankhya and how does the Vedantic Sanka of the Gita account for the fact that when one person is liberated, other people still remain bound and still perceive the same world? So now, most of you, regarding study question number 2, you guys did a pretty good job, and online you did a very good job of giving the standard answer, which is that's exactly why Sankhya posits multiple purusas, right? But of course we still run into this other problem which Bala notes. But then study question 3 is, well, how does Gita explain the multiplicity of purusas? So we're going to get to that. But now let's look at the first page of the handout. This is the chart. So now, let's first discuss very briefly some of the similarities. Most of you got this. You understood the similarities pretty well, and so we're not going to dwell on it. And I'm just going to skim through. So the 24 cosmic principles, Gita fully accepts. Okay. That's the chart in the back. But also the fact that there's a multiplicity of conscious beings in the cosmos. Both Gita's Vedantic Sankhya accepts it and also the classical Sankhya accepts it. How they account for the multiplicity of conscious beings is different, and we'll get to that as well. That goes on the differences. And they accept that the means of liberation are the dissolution of the identifying ego sense, the discriminating action of the intelligent will, and the transcendence of the action of the 3 modes of energy, the 3 gunas. You have to transcend the 3 gunas to attain liberation, all these things. We're not going to dwell on that. The first salient thing here, under the similarities, is fourth bullet point. Well, for those watching online, the handout is under the YouTube description. The Purusha, according to classical Sankhya, is eternal, passive, immobile, and immutable. Fine. What is the Gita's Vedantic Sankhya counterpart to the Purusha? It's the non-dual self. The non-dual self. The non-dual self is, I give the page numbers from Essays on the Gita, free, immaterial, immobile, eternal, and immutable. But of course, that similarity is also pointing to a difference, which you can tell by the non-dual, right? So that's why we're going to get to that below. But just keep in mind, what corresponds to the Sankhya and Purusha? It's the non-dual self in the Gita's Vedantic Sankhya. Okay. Then, intelligence and will are aspects of the insentient mind that appear to be sentient because they are illuminated by the conscious soul. Gita fully accepts this. Mind, buddhi, all fall on the side of insentient nature. Gita accepts that. And Sri Aurobindo adds this interesting point, which says that, he says, and notice that contemporary science, now we can say even more. I mean, he was writing in the early 20th century, but now with contemporary neuroscience and stuff like that, they all believe that mind, mental activities, thinking, all these things are just products of the brain, the brain functions, which are insentient. And so Sankhya philosophy really lends itself to that kind of modern scientific understanding. Now we get to differences. This is what's really important. We're going to spend the rest of the class discussing differences and ultimately this philosophical framework of Vedantic Sankhya in figure 2. Let's look at it carefully. So first bullet point. Classical Sankhya upholds the metaphysical dualism of Purusha, the eternal immaterial soul, and Prakriti, insentient nature. I've already explained that, I hope. By contrast, Bhagavad Gita's Vedantic Sankhya upholds a metaphysical non-dualism. It's a kind of Advaita. This is really important to keep in mind. Sri Aurobindo later in the essays on the Gita, he'll refer to the Gita explicitly as what he calls a real Advaita, as opposed to the Advaita of Śaṅkara, which he thinks is not purely Advaitic. Why? Because it posits māyā to account for this illusory world appearance. And so there's at least a second entity. So the real Advaita of the Gita is what's being described here, what the Vedantic Sanka is. It's a non-dualism. In what sense? What's the only reality? The purushottama. One of the reasons why this chapter is so difficult is because what Sri Aurobindo does, and it's quite typical of him, but in this chapter it's really pronounced. Even though we're only at 2.39, he's already presupposing knowledge of the later chapters. Especially, please look at the board now. These are the two key passages that he refers to again and again. And unless you understand these verses, or at least have a rough understanding of them, you won't be able to understand what the Vedantic Sankhya means. First, chapter 7, shlokas 4 through 5. Bhagavan Krishna introduces two key concepts. Apara prakriti, which means lower nature, apara, and para prakriti, the higher nature or supreme nature. Okay, how is apara prakriti defined? Exactly like the insentient prakriti of Sankhya, of classical Sankhya. It even uses the same terms: ahankara, buddhi, manas, the mahabhutas, the five elements. Okay? So that shouldn't be anything strange. So essentially, the Gita is equating the classical Sankhya prakriti with the apara prakriti, the lower prakriti, composed of the three gunas. Yeah. But there is a different kind of prakriti, and this is what's totally new and which you don't find at all in classical Sankhya or in yoga. It's the para prakriti. And this para prakriti, it literally means supreme nature. Sri Aurobindo says, Krishna understands para prakriti as Shakti, essentially, the divine Shakti. The term Shakti is not used anywhere in the Gita, but that's essentially what it is, the dynamic divine, which is Jiva Bhuta. This is really important. The term is used in 7.5. Jiva Bhuta. What does that literally mean? Jiva means the individual soul. Bhuta means, or having become, actually. So this supreme nature has become the Jiva. And now, there's another thing I wanted to mention. 15 point, I think it's 7. Mamevam sho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatanaha. Yeah, 15.7. The jiva is an amsha of the purushottama. So chapter 15, 7th verse. Mamevam sho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatanaha. Krishna says, all the jivas that you see in this world are nothing but portions of me. Sparks of the divine, parts of the divine, portions. That's what 15.7 says. Now, 15.16 and 19 introduces three more key terms. It says there are three purushas. Kshara purusha, akshara purusha, and purushottama. Kshara means literally decaying, because this world is impermanent, right? So it's the purusha, which is in this impermanent world, which is present in this world. And it includes all the jivas. And all of insentient nature. So all the cosmic principles that you find in classical Sankhya as well. Akshara Purusha, the non-dual self. Non-dual Brahman that we find in Advaita Vedanta, classical Advaita Vedanta. The witness consciousness, which is our true nature. Purushottama, this is extremely important and extremely original. Not that you don't find it in the Upanishads, but it's only hinted at in the Upanishads. And it becomes one of the central concepts in the Gita, especially in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. So what is the Purushottama? Let's look at this diagram now. Okay, so now, if I had PowerPoint, I'd be showing it on a projector. It's a little bit easier to do that. Okay, so Why is this Vedantic Sanka of the Gita non-dual? Because there's only one reality. What is that one reality? Any guesses?
Brahman.
No, not quite. Let's use the terminology of the Gita.
Sorry, what's the question?
Huh?
What is the question, sir?
I'm saying that according to Sri Aurobindo, the Vedantic Sankhya philosophy of the Gita is non-dualistic. It's non-dual. What does non-dualism mean? There's only one reality. What is that one reality?
Purushottama.
That's it. That's it. Purushottama. That's why it's non-dual. There's only one reality. It's Purushottama. That's why it's at the top of the chart. Infinite divine Purushottama. And I gave the verse references, 15.16 to 19. That's it. That's all that exists in this entire world. The Purushottama. But, what is this Purushottama? So now you need the rest of the diagram. Okay. Purushottama is, crucially, in one aspect, the inactive, non-dual self. Sakshi, Atman, Brahman. That's why we have to be careful about terminology here. Nirguna Brahman. Or Akshara Purusha. So also, I didn't add this to the chart, but you can add it next to non-dual self here if you want to know where the three Purushas fit in. The third Purusha, Purushottama, is obviously written there. Purusha Uttama, the third Purusha. But where does Akshara Purusha fit? That equals non-dual self, or pure consciousness, Nirguna Brahman. Okay, and we're going to get to Akshara Purusha soon. But now, this Purushottama is not just the non-dual self. It's equally Shakti. The term Shakti is not used. What's the term used? Paraprakriti. Paraprakriti. 7.5 of the Gita. Supreme nature. That's the term used, but part of the whole point of this course is what? Bhagavad Gita and the light of Sri Ramakrishna. So I'm also trying to show parallels with Sri Ramakrishna's language. What does Sri Ramakrishna say? What's one of his most famous teachings? Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable but equally real aspects of the same infinite divine reality. This is exactly how Sri Aurobindo understands God in the Gita. God is the Purushottama, which in its static aspect is Akshara Brahman, Akshara Purusha, the non-dual self. And in its dynamic aspect is Shakti, Paraprakriti, which manifests as everything. Sri Ramakrishna says, when I think of the of the divine reality as inactive, Jokontini Nishkriya Tokanami Brahma Valekoi, then I call it Brahman. And when I think of that same reality as creating, preserving, and destroying this world, then I call it Shakti or Kali. So this is the Purushottama. That's why you can also draw an equation at the top. The non-dual Vedantic Sanka of the Bhagavad Gita, I would say, equals Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. It's the same thing. This is why I think Sri Aurobindo's commentary, his interpretation of the Gita, is so powerful. Because he is using Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings as a framework for shedding new light on the Bhagavad Gita. There's no difference between this chart and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy.
I had one
except
question
for terminology
that I was thinking about. Mm-hmm. But Sri Ramakrishna never defines a third thing called Purushottama. He says Brahman and Shakti are basically
he says in one place, he says Tini Shakar, Nirakar, Abar Kotoki. That divine reality is with form, without form, and much more besides. Okay. See, there are many places where he says, Bhagavan kono iti ne, one can never place a limit to God. Yeah. So even if you say that, I understand God, according to Sri Ramakrishna, on the one hand it's Brahman, on the other hand it's Shakti, and that's it. It's like wrong. Never put a limit. Even saying it only has two aspects already limited God. Much more besides is always there. That's the Purushottama. Okay? So now, it's Shakti, according to the Vedantic Sanka of the Gita. It's the Shakti aspect of the Purushottama, the dynamic aspect of the Purushottama, that manifests as everything in this world. All the Jivas, so on the left-hand side of the chart, individual soul, Jiva, that term is used twice in very significant places in the Gita. Verse 15.7 of the Gita, and in verse 7.5, Paraprakriti is Jiva Bhuta. You see? So that the individual soul is explicitly conceived as a portion of the Purushottama, of the Shakti aspect or the Paraprakriti aspect of the Purushottama. Okay? And on the other hand, Shakti also manifests as this entire world of insentient entities. Okay? Sri Ramakrishna would say, from the standpoint of Vijnana, Vijnani dekhe Brahmoi Choturbinshi Tattva hoichen. The Vijnani sees that Brahman itself has become the 24 cosmic principles. And then he says, the Vijnani sees that Divine Mother has become everything. Jivas, Jagat, everything. He distinguishes that, but it's all nothing but Shakti, actually, the play of Shakti. All of us as individual souls are manifestations of Shakti, portions of the divine. The camera, the table, all insentient entities, also manifestations of the same Purushottama. You see how it's non-dual. There's nothing but Purushottama except actually manifesting. So it's not that the world is unreal. What are the Upanishadic metaphors that help us to understand this? Clay in pots, golden ornaments used in Chandogya Upanishad. It lends itself very well to this kind of understanding. Purushottama actually manifests as everything. Imagine these different names and forms as differently shaped pots, different golden ornaments, bracelets and necklaces and earrings and whatnot, right? So now let's look briefly at the nature side, at the insentient side, and then how they connect up. So on the insentient side, we have Shakti manifesting as insentient intellect, buddhi. And then there's an elaborate cosmology in classical Sankhya, which the Gita also adopts. Buddhi evolves into ahankara, ahankara evolves into manas, and the three combined, buddhi, ahankara, manas comprise the antakarana. That's not a term used in the Gita itself, but it's a standard term in Vedanta. Often translated as internal organ, but the standard, just a simple way to think about what the antakarana is mind. Except in a broader sense. I know that can be confusing because mind is understood in a very narrow sense in the traditional Indian philosophical schools. Manas, in the sense of manas. Antakarana, though, corresponds to what common sense, what mind means, because it includes typically buddhi and ego sense. So all combined, it's just mind.
The only thing is chitta is missing in this.
Yeah, that's because in Sankhya, it's not a separate category in that way. So, and it's also, you don't find it in the Gita also. But it's included under manas, basically. Yeah. Okay, so now, that antakarana, that mind, strictly insentient, right? And from ego sense also comes the 5 sense capacities, 5 action capacities, and the 5 subtle elements and 5 gross elements. That encompasses all of nature, everything we see in this world, essentially. Okay? Apart from conscious souls, which just falls on the left side. But now, remember, in Sankhya, the problem is there's no connection ultimately between these purusas, which are conscious on the one hand and non-physical, and all of physical nature on the other. That's what dualism means. Now, Sri Aurobindo says the Gita's philosophy is a bit different here. First of all, because there are multiple purusas, right, on the one hand, but each of those purusas basically, so the purusha, remember, really corresponds to the non-dual self. But the multiplicity of conscious beings corresponds to the multiplicity of individual souls, the Jivas, multiplicity of Jivas. So the simple answer, which many people got, online, almost everybody, and some of you in person as well, not all, it's the answer to study question number 3. How does the Gita's Vedantic Sanka answer this question of why is it that when one person is liberated, other people are left behind and they still see this world? Because it is the Purushottama itself which manifests as different individual souls. Real individual jivas, you see. So when one jiva attains liberation, that doesn't mean that everybody's liberated. There are other jivas who are still stuck here, seeing the same world. You see. So it's a very different answer, because the Gita has a place within its metaphysical framework for the jiva, in a way that Sankhya doesn't, arguably, at least. This is my own view, but you can think about it for yourself. But it seems to me that even if you posit a jiva in classical Sankhya, you have trouble placing it within the framework. But there is an actual, eternal, conscious, individual soul in the Gita's framework. It's called the jiva. Because that jiva is a real manifestation portion of the Purushottama, which is itself the conscious divine being. Right? And it's that jiva, which is in nature, the Kshara Purusha. So here, what I would suggest you do is, on the left side of the bottom part of the chart, like under manifest as, where you have jiva on the one side and you have all of insentient nature on the other, that whole thing taken together is Kshara Purusha. Yeah. That's how I take it. Kshara Purusha, the first of the 3 Purushas. Yeah. It's the divine Purushottama manifesting on the one hand as all the different individual jivas, and on the other hand as all the insentient entities in this world. So now we got all 3 Purushas. Do you see? We have Akshara Purusha corresponding to the non-dual self, which is the static aspect of the third Purusha, the Purushottama, Uttama Purusha, infinite divine Purushottama. And the rest of the diagram is Kshara Purusha. And we have the Para Prakriti and Apara Prakriti already in the diagram. And Apara Prakriti, do you notice it's encompassing the lower nature, which is just the insentient side of nature, from Buddhi down to the Mahabhutas. Okay, yeah.
Is Shakti same as Ishvara? The term also used, Ishvara.
Yeah, but Ishvara in the Gita, do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing is, I mean, exactly where the thing is, there's only Purushottama. You have to remember that at the end of the day.
Yes.
And so ultimately, there's only Purushottama. But that Purushottama has different aspects, static and dynamic aspects. And so Shakti is what I'm just referring to as the dynamic aspect of the Purushottama, but what Gita refers to as Paraprakriti. But Ishvara is a term that's used sometimes.
Right.
And that can also be understood as...
One thing that additionally I found very interesting, clarified for me, is just like this concept that Purushottama is able to... is separate from nature and controls the nature, but is not affected by it.
Yeah.
The same explanation is given to Jivas when they realize as well. They are essentially overcoming the nature. So therefore you can explain the bhakti way of they still can exist and not become one with Akshara. Basically.
They don't merge. The Jivas don't necessarily
merge.
So
because it's the same power like in Purushottama, the small part is there in the Jiva. I found that as a satisfactory answer finally for explaining those who want to still be
eating sugar. That's a nice way of saying it. So you're saying that because, so the Jiva, in one sense, in its deepest essence, is the non-dual self, which is Sakshi, but that might lend itself to the becoming sugar.
It's part of Purushottama.
I know, hold on, so I'm just trying to explain. Yeah, on the one hand, but at the same time, that same Jiva is also the Purushottama because it's a portion of the Purushottama. Yeah. And the Purushottama is, just like Sri Ramakrishna will say that it's like a snake which has poison. That poison can kill others, but it's not affected by the poison. It's in its mouth in a very large quantity, but the snake is not affected by it. So in the same way, the Purushottama is not affected by all the evil in this world, even though it's created it and is this world. Everything in the world is nothing but the Purushottama, and yet it's unaffected. And so in some sense, at some level of its nature, the Jiva is unaffected and is perfect, right? It's perfectly divine. And so then eating sugar becomes an equally valuable idea as becoming sugar. Yeah. Okay, so let's come back to the chart and talk more about these differences here. Do you have questions, first of all? Because it's a very heady and heavy stuff. Questions about the chart or anything I've said so far? And I'm going to address questions that people have raised. Okay, so let's keep going.
Sort of.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like I'm struggling with the individual soul being like truly individual, yet it's still being non-dual.
Yeah.
Just like the question of how if one jiva becomes liberated, everybody else doesn't. If every jiva is a portion of the Purushottama.
Yeah, that's a great question. So look, the way that I think it would be wrong to understand the Gita's framework is as follows. There's nothing but the Purushottama, and the Purushottama is like a Brad Pitt level actor. No, Brad Pitt's not even a very good actor. Anthony Hopkins level actor. And so this Anthony Hopkins Purushottama play acts as Bala, as Keshav, as Himaja, and so on and so forth. And he's playing all these different roles, and yet is the Purushottama all along. That can't be the view, because then you run into this problem, which is that it's just the Purushottama pretending to be these different jivas. If he's just pretending, then the multiplicity of individual souls is an illusion. It's not actually true, right? There isn't Hannibal Lecter and these whatever the other characters Anthony Hopkins actually played. There's just Anthony Hopkins pretending to be all these characters. That's not the way that we should think of the Purushottama manifesting as these different jivas. It's a real manifestation. That's what's crucial. I have a whole article on this, and if you're interested, it's a little bit technical though. It's published in the Monist, and it's called The Playful Self-Involution of Divine Consciousness. Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary cosmopsychism and his solution to the individuation problem. So what you're asking is actually the individuation problem. Yes. It's the problem of how, if there's only one divine reality, how that can individuate into multiple conscious beings, which have their own respective unique conscious perspectives, which are real. And it's complicated, but he does give an answer involving basically, he uses this key concept of what's called self-limitation. This is in his own philosophy. The Gita doesn't work it out, but we can use his ideas to kind of fill in the gaps in the Gita's explanation. How does the single divine Purushottama become the Jiva of Bala and the Jiva of Anthony and the Jiva of Ellis and so on? That's the question which Ellis is asking. In a real way. Because isn't there just the Purushottama all along? Sri Aurobindo says, no. Just like Kashmiri Shaivism, there are similarities with Kashmiri Shaivism here, which is a tantric tradition. There's only Shiva. And yet that Shiva playfully manifests as different Jivas. And that's because God is omnipotent. He can do things which are almost unthinkable for us as with our limited minds. He can actually manifest as different conscious souls with their own unique conscious perspectives. And your perspective will be different from Anthony's will be different from Bala's. And we can actually think that we are suffering, even though we are nothing but that Purushottama. The problem is we don't know it. And there's this kind of surface level on which we don't know that. That's the ignorance. So Sri Aurobindo will ultimately make this distinction between superficial level of our awareness and like the deeper truth. Each of us in our deepest truth is the Purushottama, one and the same Purushottama. But the whole problem is we don't know it. We're on the stream of the whatever you want to call it, the river, right? And we don't know what's at the bottom.
But by default, Jiva includes the body-mind complex too, because that's how.
No, that's on this side. Body-mind falls under the insentient nature side. The Jiva is just it's the immaterial. Oh, so this is a good. Hold on. This is important because what is the reincarnating entity? Within this Vedantic Sanka, it's not just the subtle body actually. That's part of the answer. What is it?
It's Jiva.
That's another part of the answer.
Yeah.
So what's the full answer?
Jiva
Jiva and the subtle
Associated with the subtle body.
Right.
The Jiva, that's why I have the associated with here.
Right.
The Jiva in association with a particular body-mind, not body-mind, only the mind,
Right.
departs the physical body at the time of death.
Right.
The Jiva associated with Antakarana
Yeah.
is the reincarnating
The
entity.
reason I'm saying that is that's how you can explain one individual being different because they're different minds. It's like.
Yeah,
otherwise-
but his question is from the side of the conscious soul. It's not because there's a plurality of minds, because that's all on the side of insentient nature. So that's not a complete answer. How I think the deeper question is, and it's a very serious question, is if there's only one conscious being, ultimately, the Purushottama, in what sense can there be multiple conscious beings at the same time? And so Sri Aurobindo says it's through a process of what he calls self-limitation. That's the language used in the Life Divine. He says that as an aspect of the omnipotence of the divine Purushottama, the Purushottama can actually manifest as different individual souls by limiting himself playfully, or herself, whatever you want to call God, or the Purushottama. So it's a playful self-limitation. You see, if we deprive the Purushottama of that capacity, then we limit God's omnipotence. You see, God is capable of doing things which you can't even fathom. This is one of God's activities. And then if you want more details on how that's even coherent, you can look at that article in detail. Okay, yeah, great question. Okay, so let's keep looking at the chart here. Second bullet point on our differences. There are multiple individual purusas according to classical Sankhya. That corresponds to the multiplicity of jivas in the chart, right? I hope that's clear. There's no multiplicity of non-dual selves because if it's non-dual self, by definition, they can't be multiple. So let's not get confused about language here. Because that's the Akshara Purusha, but that's not the thing that Akshara Purusha is not what corresponds to the classical Sankhya Purusha. It's the Jiva in the Vedantic Sankhya paradigm of the Gita, which corresponds to the different Purushas in Sankhya philosophy. At least from the standpoint of multiplicity. I'm sorry, I'm also confusing myself. Okay. Now, look at the bullet point on the right side, the second bullet point. There's only one non-dual Purusha, the Purushottama, who is at once the dynamic Lord of nature and the inactive witness self. At the end of the day, there's only one Purusha, which actually manifests as all the different individual Purushas at the level of Akshara Purusha. That's the different Jivas. Okay, now, how is this world created? Look at the third bullet point. This is a direct quotation from the chapter we read. Purusha and Prakriti in their dualism are the cause of the cosmos. How is that possible? Okay, this is a thing I didn't mention, but it's important. Classical Sankhya does not posit a creator God. There's no Ishvara. So what creates this world? Prakriti, in a sense, itself. This unmanifest, Sometimes scholars will refer to Prakriti in its unmanifest state as the causal matrix, the insentient, unmanifest causal matrix of all of nature, of everything we see around us. Something like that. But if it's insentient, it doesn't have consciousness. How in the world is that going to create anything?
When it comes in contact with Purusha.
Yeah, so we have to use this kind of language of coming into contact with, illuminated by, activated by. There's different kinds of language and metaphor and terms we can use, each of which I think is problematic. But yes, the standard Sankhya answer would be when Purusha is activated by, when Prakriti is activated by Purusha, then the whole world play begins. And that whole cosmological process that we see in figure 1. Purusha evolving into buddhi, ahankara, manas, jnana, indriya, tanmatra, all that whole thing. So in the state of kaivalya, what happens? Purusha separates, and so it's no longer activating Prakriti, which means then all these things devolve back into the unmanifest state, which raises the second question of Bala's, which is, then why is it not unmanifest for us? If there's one shared world that we all see, then there seems to be this problem of if one person is liberated, then nature should dissolve for everybody, but it doesn't. So then you move to a more idealistic kind of interpretation of Sankhya, which is that this world actually doesn't exist independently of minds, of conscious beings. Okay. So now, by contrast, what does the Gita's Vedantic Sankhya say? Purusha, by his Prakriti, is the cause of the cosmos. What is the Purusha here in this statement, in this particular statement? Well, yeah, I think purushottama is the simplest way, because he's using the term Purusha. So which Purusha? Purushottama, the third. As Shakti, you can say, so it's not that you're wrong. Purushottama, as dynamic Shakti, causes everything and manifests as all the Jivas. Do you see? On the one hand, manifests as all the individual souls, Jivas, and on the other hand, manifests as all of insentient nature. Okay? And so this metaphysical dualism of Sankhya really, Vedantins strongly feel that there's a problem. Like, it leaves us with a certain philosophical problem. There needs to be some unity between Purusha and Prakriti. What is that unity? The Purushottama, according to the Gita. God. So actually Ramakrishna will posit God ultimately as uniting both Purusha and Prakriti. He'll accept the Purushas on the one hand, he'll accept Prakriti on the other, except that Prakriti is, now notice, the Prakriti, so now let's look at the fourth and final bullet point. On the one hand, classical Sankhya says Prakriti is insentient and composed of the three gunas. Trigunatmika Prakriti. All of insentient nature that you see in figure 1 on the back, that's it. That's Prakriti. Composed of the three gunas. The Gita, yeah.
But doesn't the Gita also accept the three gunas?
Absolutely. And all the insentient categories in Sankhya. And it lumps it under Apara Prakriti. Apara Prakriti of 7.4 of the Gita. The lower nature. Which means it's adding another aspect to nature which is completely absent in classical Sankhya and yoga. Which is what? Para Prakriti.
Is that the two-bird?
Let's wait for it. Let's not confuse us even more. We can get to it because other people asked about the two birds, but there are no birdies in the Gita. There are birdies in the Mundaka Upanishad and in Shvetashvata Upanishad. So we'll get to the birdies, but let's hold off just for a second. So let's finish the bullet point here. Okay. There's a unitary, monolithic understanding of Prakriti in classical Sankhya. Prakriti is just the Trigunatmika Prakriti, insentient nature composed of the three gunas. Gita says no, Prakriti has two aspects. There's a lower Prakriti, which corresponds to the classical Sankhya Prakriti, and there's a higher nature, which is Shakti. It's what Sri Ramakrishna calls Shakti. It is an aspect of the divine Purushottama, it's conscious. This is completely non-existent in classical Sankhya. That's what's crucial. Okay. And it is that, Sri Aurobindo says, which has become the individual soul, the jiva. So that's the left-hand side of the chart. And then there's a typo. I forgot to delete the higher Prakriti. I don't know why, I just, by accident. So just delete higher Prakriti at the very end of that. Do you see that? Yeah, so that's just a mistake. It should end with page 80, BG 7.5. Okay, so now, before I get to questions, the questions meaning either that you have or also some people that had questions who posted them here. This chart I think is really important, not just because I spend a lot of time making it. Okay, because some of you are initiated. We're given a mantra. The mantra is typically of Sri Ramakrishna. One question that's asked is, who is Sri Ramakrishna? This chart gives the answer. Who is Sri Ramakrishna according to the chart? It's the Purushottama. Sri Ramakrishna is Purushottama. Even more, we can go even more deeply. And I'm not a guru, and I'm not going to go into like the specific aspects of the mantra. But think about it for yourself. Whatever mantra your guru has given you. My guru taught me this in this way. Different aspects of the mantra correspond to different aspects of this diagram. Not using this diagram, but so now one aspect of the mantra will correspond to the non-dual self, the Akshara Purusha. Another aspect of the same mantra will correspond to the Shakti aspect. Another aspect of the mantra corresponds to Shakti manifesting as this entire world. The Ramakrishna Sankirtanam, the many names of Sri Ramakrishna, 108 names. What's the refrain? Does anyone know? The refrain. Param Brahma Parashakti Jagad Rupa Ramakrishna. Who is Ramakrishna? Para Brahma, number one, Akshara Brahman, non-dual self. Para Shakti, Para Prakriti or Shakti, the two main aspects of the divine Purushottama. Jagad Rupa, Ramakrishna, in the form of the universe. It encompasses the entire, and that includes Jivas as well. Non-dual, so if anybody asks, yes, we're non-dualists, but not of the Śaṅkara variety. This is the fundamental confusion that most of us have because of the way that many of our monks preach and many other reasons. It's non-dual, but it's the non-dual Vedantic Sanka of the Gītā. It's the non-dualism of Vijnana Vedanta taught by Sri Ramakrishna. What's non-dual about it? There's only Purushottama. But that Purushottama, how is it different from Śaṅkara's Advaita? Because Śaṅkara will accept the non-dual self as the entirety of ultimate reality. He's not going to accept the ultimate reality of Shakti. He'll never accept Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that Brahman and Shakti are abhid. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. He'll accept Shakti at a lower level and say that it's true so long as you have not realized the highest truth of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. But he won't accept a real world manifestation. He won't accept a real Shakti at the end of the day. Do you understand? Any questions about this before I start looking at some questions that people have? So Vikas, his first question, he's from London, online. He asked the same first question as Bala asked. So several people said, wait a minute, Sri Aurobindo starts by saying that in classical Sankhya, Purusha withdraws consent, gives consent, and then he says, but actually it doesn't. I hope I've already talked about that. Vikas, the second question, is there any Shruti, meaning Upanishads or Vedas, which specifically allude to Purushottama separate from Jiva and Prakriti? Sri Aurobindo mentioned Shvetashvatara and Dvasuparna, the birdies, as Jivatma versus Paramatma, but would be interested to know if there are Shruti directly alluding to it. It's a good question. Not exactly the term. I don't think you find the term Purushottama. But you do find, for instance, look up Shvetashvatara Upanishad 6.11. God is described as, let me finish answering this question. God is the supervisor of actions, karmadhyakshaha. He lives in all beings, sarvabhutadivasaha. Sakshi, cheta, kevalo nirgunascha. Is the witness. He is the one that imparts consciousness to everybody. And kevalaha nirgunascha. It's also nirguna. It's using the term nirguna Brahma, but it's equally in the same verse referred to as saguna. Karmadhyaksha, the supervisor of all karmas, the one who distributes our karma to us and governs this entire world. So in one mantra of the Upanishad, the Shvetashvatara 6.11, God is described on the one hand as Nirguna Brahman Sakshi of classical Advaita Vedanta and also as the dynamic personal God or Shakti. So I think we can extrapolate from these kinds of verses a Purushottama concept. Because remember, the Gita is nothing but a distillation of the Upanishads. Distillation and a kind of systematization. So it may not be explicit in the Upanishads, but it's certainly latent there. And I think this is a kind of verse that lends itself to a Gita-type Vedantic Sankhya reading. Okay? Vikas's third point, it would be very helpful for you to draw out, create a PDF of Sri Aurobindo's metaphysics. So, voila! I hope Vikas is happy. Because I worked hard on it. Okay. Let's see, other questions here. Kiran, she says, this is the Kiran in our class, she had work this morning, unfortunately. I'm still confused a bit regarding how he answers the multiplicity of beings and how one can attain liberation while others remain bound. He mentions that the divine nature is the one that becomes the jiva and that the lower nature is the ego. So she understood that. But then he also says that in the higher higher nature, someone is the individual purusha. How is someone an individual purusha? Sri Aurobindo says on page 80, this individual soul is myself. In the creation, it is a partial manifestation of me. I'm not sure if I understand the English here, but I think I get the overall drift of the question. But when that quotation that you just read, Kiran, this individual soul is myself. The myself here is not Sri Aurobindo. He's talking about Krishna. He's ventriloquizing Krishna here. So maybe if you thought that that's Sri Aurobindo talking, that might lead you, like, you're barking up the wrong tree. So yeah, I think you got the basic thrust of the answer, which is that Shakti, the dynamic aspect of the Purushottama, manifests as different jivas. That is the Gita's answer to the question of how when one jiva is liberated, others stay behind. Because there's a multiplicity. So when the Bala jiva is liberated, the Medhananda jiva is still left behind. Do you see? Question? Okay.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
So
Please.
Sri Aurobindo calls this true Advaita.
Mm-hmm.
But is this not qualified?
Real Advaita.
Real Advaita. But is it not qualified non-dualism?
In what sense?
In the sense that the individual souls are a portion of the purushottama and they are strictly individual and they stay individual.
Yeah, so what does qualified non-dualism is a technical term. Vishishtadvaita, used by Ramanuja in his school, right?
But, yeah.
And so the thing is, if your question is Sri Aurobindo's understanding of Gita essentially the same as Ramanuja's? The answer is no.
Not the same.
Yeah, but it's a different kind of Advaita.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why my next book, the one that the third in my trilogy, my integral Advaita trilogy, is going to be called An All-Embracing Oneness. Sri Aurobindo's integral Advaita and the legacy of Sri Ramakrishna. An all-embracing oneness. Sri Ramakrishna, when he explains his Vijnana Vedanta, he says it's Advaita. You know why? He says Shob Jodiya Ekti in Bangla. Shob Jodiya Ekti means you take all of this as part of the one divine reality. The whole totality. What does he say? He uses the example of a bale fruit. If you weigh only the pulp of the bale fruit, the weight of the bale fruit falls short. This is the similarity with Ramanuja, and he himself points it out. Sri Ramakrishna himself points out the similarity with Ramanuja. He says, Ramanuja's philosophy lends itself to this bale fruit analogy. You can't dismiss Jiva and Jagat and say that the essence is just Ishvara. You have to take the whole kit and caboodle. Jiva, Jagat, along with it. All of this is the Purushottama. It's an all-embracing oneness and all-encompassing oneness. In that sense, non-duality, but different, distinct from Śaṅkara's. Which is, you can call it a kind of world-denying Advaita. It's an exclusive Advaita in the sense that the only reality is non-dual Brahman. Everything else turns out to be an illusion. And this non-dual philosophy of the Gita of Sri Ramakrishna is, there's only one reality, it's the Purushottama, which actually manifests as all the individual souls and as everything in this world. So the world is real, as a real manifestation of Shakti. But it's still non-dual. It's the non-duality of, let's say there are 10 different clay pots. What's non-dual about it? They're all nothing but clay. But are they differently shaped pots? One is this big, one is this big. Yes. Are they distinct from each other? Yes. Does that make sense?
Yes, that helps.
Great. More questions. This I wanted because Himaja's in the class. She'll be amused by this. Gita's asking, do you know which verse in the Upanishads Aurobindo is referring to with "There's one unborn of three colors," says a text. She's quoting from the chapter we read. The eternal feminine principle of Prakriti, with its three gunas, ever creating. And there are two Purushas, of whom one cleaves to and enjoys her, the other abandons her because he has enjoyed all her enjoyments. Yes. Which Upanishad is this? In which verse? Shvetashvatara Upanishad 4.5. And the term here, it's very interesting. The term is aja. Aja. Okay. And aja, the beauty of it, these Upanishads were punsters. They had fun. They had a sense of humor. These rishis of the Upanishads. So they're punning on the term aja. And aja means two different things. It can mean literally unborn. It also means she-goat. It really means both. And it's playing on the fact, and so the whole verse is about how this she-goat, this unborn she-goat, which represents what? Prakriti, the classical Sankhya kind of Prakriti. It lies with Purusha, and Purusha is enjoying her, and then finally Purusha is tired of her and then casts her away, and then she goes her own way, and then the Purusha is liberated. That's Kaivalya, do you see? This is the metaphor used in the Upanishad itself, which is a very classical Sankhyan metaphor. Purusha is the she-goat / but it's unborn in the sense of being unmanifest. And it's eternal. You see? So this aja term, so you'll find this, that's what Sri Aurobindo is referring to in this chapter. Prakriti of 3 gunas is the aja in Shvetashvata Upanishad 4.5. Gita Stevens in San Diego, she's also asking, Purushottama in 15.18 transcends Kshara and Akshara in the sense that it includes both and is therefore greater than the parts. Is that a gestalt thing or something else? Yeah, I think this is similar to your question. Was it your question? About how is the Purushottama exhausted in its nature by Nirguna Brahman and Shakti? And my answer was no. I don't think that's... The idea is that it's always beyond what you can never pin down the Purushottama as just this and nothing more. So that would be my answer to that. Okay, any questions here from the live audience? This is very heavy.
I have a question. So
Yes.
how does Avatara fit into it? Like, how does Avatara with body or with form becomes Purushottama?
Because he's another jiva, but it's just a very special jiva. Avatars are jivas just as much as, but they're fully aware of their power. Remember Sri Ramakrishna, he says explicitly in the Gita, when in the Gospel, he asks, what is an avatara? He says, first of all, there's nothing but Purushottama. That means everybody's Purushottama. He doesn't use the term Purushottama, Shakti. But he says how much Shakti, or to what degree Shakti manifests in each individual varies. He's talking to Vidyasagar about this, and he says, why do people respect and honor you so much? Have you grown 2 horns? No, there's a greater degree of manifestation of the divine Shakti in you. Then he says, what is the avatara? The greatest manifestation of Shakti in a human being possible.
That means they would be liberated, they are aware, but how does them being fully aware or Shakti being completely manifested help other people?
Because they're the Purushottama. And by praying to them, you're praying to the Purushottama. And who is higher than the Purushottama? If the Purushottama is the only reality. By praying to Ramakrishna, for instance, if you're a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, he is an avatara who left his body in 1886. How is that relevant to us now? Because he is the Purushottama. He still lives as Purushottama, still in the Ramakrishna form, and we can actually realize him in the Ramakrishna form if we want, if we're at that spiritual level. And by praying to Sri Ramakrishna, we're praying to the Purushottama in the form of Sri Ramakrishna, manifested Sri Ramakrishna. And so we get all the benefits of the Purushottama. Do you see what I mean? He's not different. The avatara is not different. The avatara here will be one of these individual souls, except the jiva who manifests their divinity, the Purushottama Shakti, to the highest possible degree. Does that make sense? So this should really help us, I think, as sadhakas, as spiritual aspirants. Who is Sri Ramakrishna? He's the Purushottama. And there's nothing but the Purushottama. And so you get non-duality, you get bhakti, you get jnana, you can harmonize the 4 yogas in a very beautiful way without having any of these mental conflicts about, well, isn't one higher than the other? No higher and lower. And nor is Shakti a lower reality, nor is this world ultimately a dream. Everything is Purushottama, but this world is real, and each of us is real. Think of us, we should try to think of ourselves as playmates of the divine. And by doing that and by evolving spiritually, we'll ultimately realize that we ourselves are amshas, portions of the divine. We become. So at the end of his beautiful essay, he wrote an essay, Swami Vivekananda, called Hindu Dharma or Sri Ramakrishna. Hinduism and Sri Ramakrishna. The last statement in that, I have a whole class on this. It's like a 5-part class. You can look it up. What is Hindu Dharma? He says, so let us now realize that we are playmates of the divine, of Sri Ramakrishna, he says, specifically, because he's addressing devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, and set ourselves to action, set ourselves to work. That's it. That's all you have to do. Be the baby kitten, know yourself as an instrument of the divine, and then serve others in a spirit of worship. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Gopal? Has the recording stopped?
No, it has nothing to do with the class.
Okay.